we move from mobile game design to narrative design. Please welcome Alice Rendell.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here and speak with you today. My name is Alice Rendell, and I'm a narrative designer, and I've been in the industry about 15 years and worked on a whole bunch of different games, including some big AAA titles like Star Wars Outlaws and Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which I worked on at my time at Massive Entertainment with Ubisoft. And I've also worked on a bunch of indie games, including an episodic adventure game, my own little indie title, The Monster in Me. I've worked on a tabletop RPG based on the 5th season book series. And I've also worked on a JRPG called Zodiac Orcanon Odyssey, which I got to work on with some ex-Final Fantasy developers, which was a little bit of a geeky dream come true for me. And now I work at Off-Leash Interactive. It's a small indie company in Stockholm, Sweden. We're working on our first game. We're about 20 people right now, and we also have 3 dogs. And my job here is to be a narrative designer, which is a job role that falls somewhere between a writer and a game designer. So it's my job to make sure that the story we're telling actually makes sense with the gameplay. So a traditional writer for film or TV, you might need to think about who your characters are, the world you're setting your story in, and then you would actually have to write the story itself. And in games, as a narrative designer, you absolutely do all of this too, but you have that additional skill that needs to be taken into consideration, which is interactivity. Which means that you have so much less control over how your audience experiences a story. In films, you have these no-named extras who are in the background, and they kind of blend in with the crowd. And in films, you don't need to know who these people are. You don't need to know why they're in that specific place at that specific time, because you'll probably never see them again. But in games, you could walk right up to one of these extras, one of these background people, and talk to them, and ask them questions, and invite them maybe to join your adventure. So it's a narrative designer's job, not only to design the characters, the setting, and the story, but also design how you interact with everything in that world. Whether that's through dialogue options, with the player choosing specific dialogue choices in a conversation, or through these epic blockbuster cutscenes. So being a narrative designer is not just about what your story is, it's also about how the player consumes that story. Which means you have to work with every single department in a game studio, from gameplay to code and pretty much everything else in between. Because since the dawn of time, humans have been telling stories to each other around the campfire, because it's such an effective way to get across ideas. And you may have heard of this age-old storytelling rule of show, don't tell, which means it's better to absorb things you see rather than just read about them or be told about them explicitly. But in games, you can take this one step further, because you have the opportunity to experience, don't show. I truly believe there's no other platform in the world that allows you to walk in someone else's shoes in this way and experience just a little bit what it's like to be them. And that's why I became a narrative designer, to be able to tell these stories through gameplay. And today, I'd like to give you some of the tools that I use to help tell stories in games by focusing on the creative processes for narrative design, and specifically how to build gameplay to support the core message of your game and the core themes of your game. Because for a really long time in the industry, the story was considered this narrative wrapper, right? So it was when you have your gameplay and you wrap narrative around it to give it some context. And this doesn't work. It means the narrative was probably an afterthought, it wasn't designed in tandem with the gameplay, and players will be able to feel that disconnect while they're playing. So instead, we should focus on narrative DNA. So gameplay, systems, and features that are designed in tandem with the narrative, and the two really support and solidify each other. So I will present to you some of the tools I use that can help do this, based on some core principles of storytelling. The first one is the controlling idea. So in storytelling, the controlling idea is your main theme of a story. But to put in like very specific terms from the screenwriter Robert McKee, a controlling idea may be expressed in a single sentence describing how and why life undergoes change from one condition of existence at the beginning to another at the end. This is a little wordy, so I'm going to break it down line by line and unpack this a little. So, first part, a controlling idea may be expressed as a single sentence. So this one's a bit clear. McKee is just asking you to describe your story in one sentence. The next part, I'm actually going to jump to the last part of this sentence. From one condition of existence at the beginning to another at the end. So McKee is just being a little fancy here. What he means is, what is the state of your world in the beginning of your story, and what is the state of it at the end? Because all stories are about the world changing in some way, whether that's like literally the whole world, like in The Matrix, or it's a change that happens to an individual, like in Kill Bill. Okay, now the middle of this sentence, which says, describing how and why life undergoes change. So here McKee is just asking to describe how that story changes. Like, how did it get from that beginning state to that end state? And why? Why is that an interesting thing for your audience to view and follow? So if I was going to put this into something a lot more applicable to games, it would be, a controlling idea is a single sentence describing how your story changed from the beginning to the end. So this is much simpler. And I'm actually going to add one more thing that's missing from McKee's sentence, which is, and who is making this change? Because for us, the who is the player, and that's such an incredibly important thing for games. So now I'll give you some examples of this controlling idea from films and TV. So in Lord of the Rings, evil is defeated when ordinary people have courage. Evil being defeated is the state of the world. Sorry, evil being the state of the world at the beginning. Evil being defeated is the state of the world at the end. And ordinary people are the who that is making that change to the world. And then how they do it is through courage. Here's another one. In Sherlock, crimes are brought to justice when the detective is smarter than the criminals. With crimes being the state of the world at the beginning, justice is the state of the world at the end, and being smarter is how the story changes. And who makes that change? It's Sherlock, it's the detective. And I'm going to do one more example, this time from games. So in the original Last of Us, a grieving father overcomes his grief by protecting his surrogate daughter. With the grieving father being the state of the world at the beginning, which in this case is Joel's state of mind rather than the state of the whole world. Overcoming his grief is the end state of the story, and protecting his surrogate daughter is how he overcomes this grief. And actually, in this case, both the surrogate daughter and the father are the who of this story, because The Last of Us, it's really about the two of them. And you'll notice as well here that I've not put anything about the world itself and about the setting. There's nothing here about zombies and viruses and post-apocalyptic settings, because that's not the main heart of this story, which is why I think The Last of Us is so powerful as a story, because their main controlling idea is about the people and their journey. And the world it's set in is just used to support and embrace that. That's why I think The Last of Us really nailed their narrative DNA, with both story and gameplay really reinforcing that idea of protecting. So why is the controlling idea a useful tool? Well, it will help guide a lot of your decisions when you're making a game. When adding something to a game, like a new feature or a new system, you can ask, is it supporting your initial idea? Is what you're adding helping get your player character from their start state to their end state? Because when making a game, you're faced with so many decisions on a daily basis, and very often there is no right or wrong answer. There's just a decision you make and a path you take, and you go with it. So having a controlling idea like this helps guide those decisions in a more cohesive direction. So the next tool I'd like to present is something called the Core Qualities Quadrant. It's a diagram that helps frame all the different variations of your game's theme and gives structure on how to explore that theme in your game. So the quadrant starts with a core quality or a theme. So I'm going to take something very classic like strength. And I think we can all agree that strength is a positive. It's a positive thing, but when you have too much strength, that might lead to a pitfall, such as aggression. That's a negative outcome of the theme you have. But then if we looked at the positive opposite of aggression, we have restraint, which provides an interesting challenge for both aggression and for strength. To remain strong but restrained is something to master in this theme. But too much restraint can lead to weakness, which is also the opposite of strength. So what this diagram is doing is it's taking your theme and it's giving you a framework in how to explore that theme in your game and in your story. Because you wouldn't make a game where you felt strong the whole time and never really challenged, because that would be a bit of a boring game. So it's exactly the same with story. You want to have those peaks and troughs. In the same way, a level designer would add highs and lows into their level design pacing. You need that with the story as well. So this diagram kind of helps inform you on where to go while you're telling this story. So I'm going to do another one. My theme this time is love. Then a pitfall of that could be blind love. However, the positive of blind love could be passion. but too much passion could lead to hate. So this is a really useful tool, not only for narrative, but also game design, because you can design mechanics and features around the qualities of your quadrant. So, for example, in Uncharted, the game includes a lot of different features that would tie into each one of these themes. So you have strength, like the controls you have when you're jumping over rocks. Nathan Drake is literally holding onto the edge of cliffs with his fingertips. This is strength. The controls are made to make you feel strong. And then, sorry, I jumped ahead. Nope. And then you have aggression. You have the shooting mechanic. You have melee combat. The game explores the negative trait of strength and literally gives you the option to violently murder a bunch of people. But you also have restraint. You have the stealth mechanic. You're still strong when you're in stealth, but it's more restrained than when you're shooting and in melee combat. And then you have weakness, which is kind of the crux of the game. You will constantly come up against bosses and challenges that you can't overcome, and you can't kill them right away. So you have to get more skilled to overcome them. Another great way to use the quadrant is actually for plotting the content of your game, whether that's missions, levels, or cinematics. You can plot them on the graph to see if you're covering all the areas of your theme. And if they're weighted too much in one quadrant, then maybe create some more so they're spread out as much as possible over everything. So the core qualities quadrant is a great tool not only for narrative, but it's also used in businesses, marketing, and lots of other places. But I think it's a really, really useful one for making games. So the tools I've shown you today, they aren't new concepts. They're very old concepts for storytelling. Like people have been designing narrative like this for a millennia. It's just we don't always have the labels and the diagrams to give it some structure. And games, comparatively to other forms of storytelling, are quite young. So we need as many of these structures as possible to use for designing, because a lot of them aren't in place yet. But there are some storytelling rules in other forms that just aren't applicable to games at all. And it's the one I call the protagonist problem. So in linear storytelling, you watch your character, the protagonist, on screen, deliberating over choices, and they're designed for you to relate to them. They're designed for you to root for them. What's interesting for us when we're watching a character we love is, oh, I wonder what they're going to do next. What decisions are they going to make? How are they going to solve all the problems that are thrown their way? We care about the characters from Succession because we want to see what happens to them. We want to see how they handle each situation, and we want to know who they'll be at the end of this story. But in games, we want to know what choices they will make and who they will become at the end. But in games, you are the protagonist, and you know who you are, and you know what decisions you are likely to make. And you probably know it's going to turn all right at the end, because it's a game. Games are made to be succeeded. You're probably not going to die, or if you are, you'll just respawn and keep going. With enough effort, you will win the game. So you kind of already know how everything's going to turn out overall. It's just the details that are missing. And this is kind of counterintuitive to why we love stories. So how do we solve the protagonist problem? Well, this is where gameplay comes in, right? The interesting thing about games, it's not the ending. A lot of people don't get to the end of games and the end of a story. It's about the journey along the way. I think if you ask friends what the most memorable part of a game is, yeah, sometimes it might be a cutscene where there's like a big twist and a beloved character dies. The scene from Final Fantasy VII still hurts nearly 30 years later for me. But think how much more powerful it would have been if you played this moment. You tried to stop Sephiroth from killing Aerith, and you failed, and that resulted in her death. Because more often than not, it is the gameplay that sticks in memories for the player. It's the time as a kid I got stuck on the water temple in Ocarina of Time for weeks, and then went into school and found out everybody else was stuck on the exact same level as I was. It's the time in Far Cry where a bear ran past me on fire, and I had no idea where it came from or how it even got on fire in the first place. It's the time in The Walking Dead where the game asked me to make a decision about a beloved character. And actually, this example is such a great moment in a game where you know the ending of the story. Both of these choices pretty much end up at the same place, but it's the how you get there that's interesting for the player, and that's what's important. So that's how we solve the protagonist problem with gameplay. We aren't just making stories to get a player from the beginning to the end and just attaching them to a character in the world to get there. What we're doing instead is we're creating unique playable memories, as if the players themselves are the ones experiencing that story. And that can only be done if narrative and gameplay are working together. They have to support each other. They have to strive for the same goal. Because games, if I'm honest, get a pretty bad reputation when it comes to narrative. They are seen often as a lesser form of storytelling than traditional media like TV, film, and literature. And I don't necessarily agree with this. Yes, sometimes it doesn't work, but when it does, it can be so powerful, and it can leave deep, long-lasting impressions on players, and more so, I think, than any film, book, or TV show. So I really think that we can create more meaningful experiences because of gameplay and narrative working together. So if I can summarize, use the controlling idea to define your core theme and intentions for your story. Use the core qualities quadrant to map out how you are going to explore that theme through gameplay and content. And tackle the protagonist problem by creating systems that allow for unique playable memories. Now, these tools I presented are just some of the ways you can add narrative design to your creative processes, but there are many others out there. These are just the ones I've found that work for me. But you can take these, you can modify them, tweak them, whatever works for you and your project. The important thing is to strive away from this narrative wrapper that we've been seeing for so long and move more towards narrative DNA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take one or two questions. Anyone else?
Hi. So Sorry, I'm a bit sick. You said that games compared to other forms of storytelling are still quite young. And my first reaction was to disagree.
Comparatively.
But my point was that I think that all the oldest games do tell a story. And with a beginning, a how, what, and an end, as you mentioned in your talk. And I was thinking about the example of, for example, the game Senet from 3100 BC that talks about a symbolic view of the journey of the afterlife and the soul's journey to the Duat, or even Go from China, where we talk about capturing territory with symbols of power, balance, and intellect. So I was merely curious, why is your stance that it's still young? And apologies for my voice.
I guess digital storytelling, specifically.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Other questions?
You said that there are games that have like the narrative just wrapped around it. Do you mean games that like have just very, very like few and not very well utilized narrative signs? Like, I don't know, I'm thinking like Dr. Mario is basically Tetris, but just with different visuals. Or do you also mean like there are some games that they have their gameplay embedded into the narrative, but at the same time, basically the gameplay is just traveling through a map. So basically the story can't be just traveling through a map, even though it is part of the story, it doesn't really tell the story. So are you referring to like the more like traditionally a bit primitive forms of narrative in games, or are you referring to like everything that is gameplay that doesn't really tell the story?
With a narrative wrapper, what I'm referring to, it's not games that maybe have a light narrative. Like Dr. Mario is actually really interesting because I think from the beginning it was Dr. Mario. That was the world that was the fantasy they were selling. What I'm talking about is when in game production you might be making a game for years, months, whatever it is, and then you go, oh, we need a setting here, we need a story, but your gameplay is already designed and your features and your levels are already designed, and then someone comes in and goes, okay, I just need to sort of attach a layer of narrative over to this already existing game. And that's when it doesn't work, because if someone narrative was there at the beginning, they could tweak that gameplay and features and level to support whatever story they decided a bit more.
Okay, I can't really imagine to make an entire game and just put the narrative at the end, but
it happens. It happens.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Alice. Okay, very, very short one.
Hey, Alice, great talk. You talk about how players experience and interact with your story. Has your approach or your design changed after you've seen how players experience and play your games?
You mean from like play-testing and all
or just,
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think like with all game development, you're in your game development bubble, right? And it's very hard to see things from fresh eyes and someone new. It's entirely the same for story. I think a big pitfall that we all fall into with story is like giving an exposition intro, because you've spent years creating these characters and this story, and you're like, I love them so much, please play, I love my characters as much as I do. And a lot of the time people don't care. At least not at the beginning. You've got to earn for them to care. And that's okay. It's their choice if they don't want to care about the story in that moment. So yeah, playtesting has been really interesting. One thing that I take away a lot in data is when people skip cutscenes in playtests, because a lot of the time it's not just because the writing's bad, it's because they're in a bad pacing and players are in a hurry and they're urgent, they're not taking a breathing space. So yeah, using that data to let your players absorb story when you actually want them to absorb the story is something I super recommend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.